Imagine the sound of 100 engines roaring in unison, shaking the ground beneath a quiet suburban street. It wasn't a parade, nor a celebration. It was a wall of steel and leather, a brotherhood of bikers who had come for a single purpose: to protect the most vulnerable. On that day, they surrounded a school, not with menace, but with a mission: to shield children from a teacher whose cruelty had turned classrooms into cages. For weeks, whispers had traveled through the town. Parents saw the fear in their children's eyes, heard the tremor in their voices, but felt powerless to act. The bully wore authority like armor, his position as a teacher giving him power others were too afraid to challenge. The kids endured humiliation, day after day, until their silent suffering reached the ears of people the town never expected, men and women often branded as outcasts, whose loyalty ran deeper than any stereotype. When the 100 bikers arrived, their presence was overwhelming. The thunder of their engines silenced every mocking word the teacher had ever spoken. Neighbors stepped out of their houses, stunned, phones in hand, recording a moment that felt larger than life. Children pressed their faces against classroom windows, their wide eyes filled with something they hadn't felt in months: safety. For the first time, the bully was no longer the most powerful figure in their world. The teacher, once untouchable, now found himself staring at a sight he never expected. Rows of bikers, their arms crossed, their faces unflinching, stood guard at the school gates. They said nothing because they didn't have to. Their very presence was louder than any words. It was a message carved into the air: these kids are no longer alone. And in that moment, the entire town realized a profound truth. Sometimes heroes don't arrive in uniforms or polished suits. Sometimes they come roaring in on motorcycles, carrying the weight of justice on their shoulders. That day, 100 bikers turned fear into courage, silence into defiance, and a group of broken children into a generation that would never again believe they were powerless. The schoolyard, once filled with nervous glances and hushed whispers, became a place of awe when the bikers lined its perimeter. Children who had dreaded stepping through those doors now clung to the windows with wide-eyed wonder, their fear slowly replaced by an unfamiliar feeling: protection. The air was thick with the deep growl of engines that spoke louder than any promise an adult had ever made to them. It was the sound of strength, standing guard where innocence had been wounded. Inside, the teacher who had wielded authority like a weapon was visibly shaken. For so long, he had believed his position made him untouchable, his cruelty hidden beneath the guise of discipline. But as the children pressed their palms against the glass, watching the unexpected guardians outside, the balance of power shifted. The teacher's dominance no longer felt absolute. It was fragile, trembling under the weight of 100 engines. The bikers did not storm the classrooms, nor did they shout. They simply stood, arms crossed, eyes steady, their presence speaking volumes. Their silence was not emptiness, it was strategy. It was a silence that forced the teacher to face his own reflection, stripped of the control he once held. The contrast between his cowardice and their resolve was undeniable, and even the children could see it. Parents began to gather at the gates, their faces filled with both relief and disbelief. They had feared confronting the teacher, fearing backlash or punishment against their children. But watching the bikers, they realized they were no longer alone. Their quiet suffering had found a voice, not in officials or bureaucrats, but in a group of outsiders who had decided enough was enough. For the children, the sight of those bikers became a memory etched into their hearts. For the first time in months, they felt that someone powerful was standing on their side. The playground that once symbolized anxiety now became a fortress, and the children walked a little taller, their heads lifted by the strength of those who came to defend them. The following day, the story spread through town like wildfire. Videos of 100 motorcycles circling the school flooded social media, drawing reactions from neighboring communities and even national attention. The world watched as men and women, often labeled as misfits, revealed a side of humanity few expected: fierce protectors of children who had been silenced for far too long. Inside the classrooms, the dynamic shifted. The teacher, once feared for his sharp words and cruel punishments, now found himself under the weight of countless eyes. Every insult he had once spat carried less sting. Every gesture of intimidation fell hollow. The children, who had once bowed their heads in shame, now met his gaze with something he never anticipated: courage. The biker's presence transformed into more than a shield. It became a lesson. The children learned that justice could arrive in unexpected forms, and that strength was not reserved for the privileged or the powerful. They began to whisper among themselves, not in fear, but in wonder. For them, the bikers were no longer strangers. They were legends who had turned their pain into a battle cry. Parents, too, found themselves emboldened. They began speaking openly about the treatment their children had endured, stories once buried, now spilling into the open. The bikers had given them more than protection. They had given them permission to demand justice. The silence that had protected the bully for so long was shattered, and with it, his reign of fear began to crumble. And while the teacher tried desperately to cling to authority, the truth was undeniable. The walls of his power were collapsing. The school, once his domain, had become the stage for a greater story, one in which children learned the meaning of courage, parents rediscovered their voices, and 100 bikers proved that sometimes the most feared are also the most fearless defenders of what is right. By the third day, the bikers were no longer just guardians at the school gates. They were role models. Children began to wave at them each morning, some even daring to approach, their small hands reaching out to touch the chrome of a motorcycle or the leather of a jacket. What once looked intimidating now felt safe, almost comforting, like a fortress built of steel and humanity. The bikers responded with gentle smiles, nods of reassurance, and small gestures of kindness that spoke louder than words. The teacher, however, grew restless. His authority had been built on fear, but fear had slipped through his fingers like sand. The sound of the engines outside became his daily reminder that the world was watching. Each slam of his ruler on a desk felt weaker, each threat less convincing. The children sensed it. They sat taller, their voices stronger, no longer afraid to challenge his cruelty. His power had not only diminished, it had been dismantled. In the evenings, the bikers gathered at a nearby diner, planning shifts so the school would never be unguarded. Their loyalty was unwavering. Some had faced hardships of their own as children: abandonment, abuse, neglect. Protecting these kids was not just about justice, but about healing their own scars. Every hour spent standing watch was a vow that no child would endure what they once had. The parents, moved by the bikers' sacrifice, began to stand beside them. Some brought coffee and sandwiches. Others offered blankets during cold nights. Bonds were forged between unlikely allies. Mothers who had once crossed the street to avoid the bikers now embraced them as heroes. The line between outsider and protector blurred, replaced by a single word that united them all: family. And with each passing day, the story became bigger than the town itself. Journalists arrived, cameras rolled, and headlines carried the tale of 100 bikers who had chosen children over indifference. The world was watching, but more importantly, the children inside that school were watching. For them, it was proof that their pain mattered, that their voices deserved to be heard. The teacher's mask of authority began to crack. He no longer strode through the hallways with confidence. Instead, he slithered through them, trying to avoid the eyes of his students. Every whisper felt like an accusation, every giggle a rebellion. His classroom, once a kingdom of fear, had turned into a cage of his own making. The walls that had silenced the children now echoed with the quiet rebellion of hope. But the bikers' new victory was not yet secure. Bullies, whether in playgrounds or positions of power, often strike hardest when cornered. They stayed vigilant, aware that one desperate act could undo everything they had fought to build. Their strategy was simple yet powerful: remain present, remain unshakable, remain a reminder that cruelty would not go unanswered. One morning, a young girl who had once been the teacher's favorite target walked out of school with her head held high. Her voice did not tremble when she told her story to a reporter. Her words cut through the silence like a blade. "He made me feel small. They made me feel strong." That moment became the spark that ignited the entire community, transforming whispers into demands for accountability. Parents flooded the school board with letters, petitions, and meetings. They were no longer pleading, they were demanding. The bikers had given them courage, but it was the parents who now carried the torch forward. The teacher was summoned, his actions scrutinized under a spotlight he could no longer escape. What once had been hidden behind classroom walls was now broadcast for the world to judge. And as the sun set that evening, the roar of 100 engines once again filled the streets, not as a threat, but as a promise. A promise that justice would not be silenced, that the days of unchecked cruelty were over, and that no child would ever again walk into that school believing they were alone. The school board finally held an emergency meeting. Parents filled the auditorium, their voices trembling not with fear, but with determination. For years, their concerns had been dismissed as exaggerations, but now, with the world watching, the truth could no longer be ignored. Every testimony cut through the room like a blade. Stories of children humiliated, confidence shattered, and innocence stolen. The weight of those voices pressed heavily against the walls of authority. Outside, the bikers remained stationed. Their engines were silent now, but their presence was deafening. Children leaving the meeting waved to them as though they were guardians from a storybook, protectors sent not by fantasy, but by choice. The teacher, summoned to defend himself, walked past those rows of leather and steel, his face pale and eyes darting. For the first time, he was the one being watched, measured, and judged. The testimonies grew stronger, more vivid, each parent adding to the chorus of justice. Some cried, others shouted, and some could only whisper, but every word became part of a rising tide that no one in power could resist. It was no longer just about one teacher. It was about the failure of a system that had turned a blind eye, and about the people who refused to let it continue. The children themselves began to speak. Small voices rose from the audience, carrying truths too heavy for their age. One boy, his hands trembling, stood and said, "I thought nobody cared, but now, I know they do." His words silenced the room. Even the most hardened faces softened, because no argument could erase the raw honesty of a child's pain. That night, the board promised a full investigation, but promises were not enough. The parents, the children, and the bikers all knew the fight wasn't over. They had lit a fire that could not be extinguished, and the question remained, would justice follow, or would it need to be taken? The following week, the bikers continued their vigil. Each morning, the thunder of 100 motorcycles escorted children to school, their engines like drums of reassurance. The children no longer walked with their eyes on the ground. They ran to the gates, laughing, their fear replaced by pride. They carried the knowledge that someone powerful had chosen to stand with them, and that knowledge became armor. The teacher, meanwhile, found his world collapsing. Every glare from the children, every whisper in the hallway, every nod from a parent reminded him that his reign was over. Authority is fragile when built on fear, and without it, he was nothing more than a man exposed. His attempts at discipline were met not with silence, but with resistance. The children had found their voices, and no amount of shouting could take them back. Media crews lined the sidewalks, documenting every shift in the story. What had begun as a local scandal became a national debate about power, responsibility, and the role of protectors in society. The bikers, once branded as outlaws, were now praised as unlikely heroes. They gave interviews not to boast, but to remind the world of the simple truth. No child should ever fear the place where they go to learn. But behind the cameras and headlines, the bikers remained grounded. They shared meals with families, listened to children's stories, and promised that their presence was not temporary. This wasn't about spectacle, it was about change. They were determined to stay until the community was sure its children were safe, no matter how long it took. And in those days, something extraordinary happened. The children began to see themselves differently. They were no longer victims of a bully. They were survivors, witnesses to a movement born from their suffering, and participants in a story that would be told long after the engines went silent. As weeks passed, the schoolyard transformed. Where fear had once lingered, laughter returned. Children played freely, their voices filling the air without the weight of intimidation. Parents watched from the gates, some still in disbelief that the nightmare was finally being unraveled. The bikers, lined along the fences, became as familiar as the teachers themselves. To the children, they were no longer strangers. They were part of their story, part of their safety. The teacher, however, lived under a shadow of his own making. Every step he took was marked by stares, every movement questioned by eyes that no longer looked away. He tried to act as if nothing had changed, but the silence of his students was gone. Instead, they whispered openly, compared stories, and stood together. His isolation grew deeper each day. A prison he had once built for others now closing in on him. The bikers knew their presence was temporary, but they also knew their impact would not fade. They had become a symbol for the town, a living reminder that justice often arrives in unexpected forms. Their bond with the families deepened with every passing moment. Birthday parties, school fairs, even late-night talks over coffee at the diner. They had come to protect, but they stayed to belong. One afternoon, a little girl ran out of the school and handed a biker a drawing she had made. It showed motorcycles lined in front of her classroom, and in the center stood a child holding a sign that read, "We are safe." The biker, a man hardened by years on the road, felt tears sting his eyes. It was proof that their mission had worked, not because of the fear they inspired, but because of the hope they created. And slowly, the story began to move beyond the town. Other communities started calling, asking for help, asking for guidance. The 100 bikers who had once been seen as outsiders had now become guardians of a movement, proof that even the most misunderstood can carry the greatest strength. But the fight was not yet finished. The teacher, desperate to salvage his reputation, tried to paint himself as the victim. He accused the bikers of intimidation, claimed the parents were exaggerating, and insisted the children had misunderstood him. His words reached newspapers and talk shows, but they rang hollow against the tide of testimonies and the unwavering presence of those who had seen the truth firsthand. The school board, pressured by the overwhelming evidence, launched a full-scale inquiry. Investigators spoke to parents, reviewed footage, and listened to the stories of children who finally felt brave enough to speak. The teacher's mask of control crumbled further with each testimony, each revelation a nail in the coffin of his authority. His attempts to twist the narrative only highlighted his desperation. Through it all, the bikers never lost focus. They did not lash out at accusations, nor did they allow anger to dictate their actions. They simply remained visible, steadfast, and silent when needed, their presence enough to remind everyone where justice stood. Their discipline became as inspiring as their defiance. They were no longer just fighters. They were protectors with purpose. The children continued to change too. Their voices grew louder, their confidence more visible. They stood taller in class, raised their hands without hesitation, and smiled where they once frowned. The bully teacher had taken pieces of their spirit, but with the support of their families and their unlikely protectors, those pieces were slowly being rebuilt into something stronger. And as the town watched this transformation unfold, one truth became impossible to deny. The day 100 bikers surrounded a school was not just a day of protection. It was the day an entire community learned what it meant to stand together, to turn fear into strength, and to give power back to the powerless. The inquiry reached its climax in a packed auditorium. Parents, children, journalists, and townsfolk filled every seat. The teacher, once arrogant and untouchable, now sat slumped at the front, his eyes darting nervously. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Everyone knew the truth, but they waited for it to be spoken aloud. When the testimonies began, there was no holding back. One by one, children took the microphone, their voices trembling but unbroken. Each story painted the same picture: cruelty hidden behind authority, humiliation passed off as discipline, fear disguised as teaching. The audience grew restless, gasps echoing through the hall as the weight of his actions became undeniable. The bikers stood along the back wall, their presence quiet but commanding. They weren't there to intimidate. They were there to witness, to remind everyone that the children's words mattered. Their stillness contrasted sharply with the teacher's fidgeting, and the crowd couldn't help but see who truly embodied strength. At last, the mother of one of the youngest children stepped forward. Her voice cracked with emotion as she described the nights her child cried before school, begging not to return. She turned toward the teacher, her eyes steady. "You broke their spirit," she said, "but we rebuilt it. And this time, it's stronger than you will ever be." The room erupted in applause. The board, overwhelmed by the evidence, announced their decision. The teacher was removed from his position effective immediately. Justice had been spoken, not from a courtroom, but from the hearts of those who had suffered and endured. The nightmare had ended, but the story was far from over. The following morning, the town awoke to a new reality. The schoolyard, once shadowed by fear, was alive with joy. Children laughed freely, their voices carrying across the playground without the weight of intimidation. Parents hugged one another, their relief palpable, and the bikers, lined once more along the gates, received smiles, handshakes, and grateful tears. The teacher had been defeated, but what mattered more was what had risen in his absence: unity. The town had learned that silence enables cruelty, but courage dismantles it. The 100 bikers hadn't just protected children from a bully. They had taught an entire community that strength belongs to those who refuse to stand by. The children themselves carried the greatest transformation. They no longer saw school as a place of fear, but as a space reclaimed. Their voices grew louder, their laughter bolder, and their confidence brighter. What had once been stolen was now returned to them in full measure, and they would carry that lesson for the rest of their lives. The bikers, though restless souls by nature, stayed long enough to ensure the safety was permanent. They knew their engines could not remain forever outside the school, but they also knew their impact would linger in every child's heart. They had written themselves into the town's history, not as outlaws, but as guardians who stood where others had turned away. And as they rode away in formation one final time, the roar of 100 engines echoed through the streets, not as noise, but as a legacy. It was the sound of justice, of resilience, of hope. A reminder that sometimes the most unlikely heroes carry the loudest message: no child should ever walk alone in fear. What began as fear in a single classroom became the spark of a movement that shook an entire community. 100 bikers did more than surround a school. They shattered silence, exposed cruelty, and turned pain into courage. In their rumble, children found their voices again, and parents discovered the strength to demand what had always been owed: safety and dignity. This story teaches us that justice does not always come from titles or authority. Sometimes, it rises from the least expected places, from people dismissed as outcasts, who carry loyalty in their veins and courage in their hearts. The bikers were not saviors in shining armor. They were ordinary men and women who chose not to look away, who proved that true strength lies in standing for those who cannot stand for themselves. The children, once silenced, will never forget the lesson carved into their memories. They matter. Their voices matter. Their dreams matter. And when cruelty tries to steal those truths, there will always be someone willing to roar louder than fear. That moment at the school gates was not only about protection. It was about transformation, about showing an entire generation that resilience is stronger than intimidation. And perhaps the most powerful reflection is this: courage is contagious. One voice becomes many, one act of defiance becomes a wave, and one stand of protection becomes a legacy. We are all capable of sparking change, of becoming shields for the vulnerable, of proving that silence is never the answer when injustice stands in the open. If this story touched you, let it live beyond the screen. Share your thoughts in the comments. Add your voice to the conversation. And if you want to continue experiencing stories that inspire courage and resilience, subscribe and like the video. Together, we can keep these lessons alive and ensure they echo far beyond the walls of this tale.